she realized it during a moment that should have felt reassuring. It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind she usually appreciated. Laundry folded, groceries put away, the week ahead already arranged in her mind. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom, holding a stack of clean clothes, and paused for no clear reason. Everything was handled. Bills paid, messages answered, plans confirmed, and yet she felt slightly detached from the fact that it was her life being handled. She placed the clothes in the drawer, aligning the edges the way she always did, then closed it carefully. She sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled, noticing how automatic the movement felt. The apartment was calm, stable, predictable. Exactly what she had worked toward for years. That used to feel like success. She remembered a time when Sundays felt different. Back then, they carried uncertainty, sometimes anxiety, sometimes excitement. She never knew exactly how the next week would unfold, and that uncertainty once made her restless. She wanted control, structure, a sense that nothing would suddenly fall apart. So she built that life. She chose a career that paid steadily, even when other options felt more interesting but less certain. She stayed in relationships that felt reasonable, even when they lacked depth, because they fit cleanly into her routine. She avoided paths that required too much explaining. To her family, to her colleagues, to herself. None of it felt like settling at the time. It felt like growing up, like making mature decisions. People often told her she was doing well, that she had her life together. She believed them. She still did. But sitting there now, she noticed how rarely her days surprised her. Surprise had become inefficient. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing a faint crack she had noticed years ago and never bothered to fix. The muted sounds of the building surrounded her. A door closing somewhere. Water running in another apartment. Someone laughing briefly, then silence again. Lives moving along familiar tracks. She thought about how carefully she managed risk, not only financially but emotionally. She chose stability even in small moments, conversations she didn't start because they might complicate things, questions she didn't ask because the answers could require action, invitations she declined because they didn't fit neatly into the rhythm she had created. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they formed a pattern she rarely questioned. She wasn't unhappy. That mattered to her. Unhappiness would have demanded action. What she felt was quieter than that. She felt maintained. Her calendar was full but not demanding. Meetings, workouts, dinners planned days in advance. Her routines worked. Her relationships were steady. Nothing required her to stretch beyond what she already knew how to give. At some point, without noticing when she happened, lowered her expectations of time. She no longer expected it to surprise her. She expected it to move smoothly, predictably, without resistance. That expectation had quietly become a standard. She sat up and reached for her phone, then stopped. She held it in her hand for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, then set it back down without unlocking it. The pause felt intentional, even though she hadn't planned it. She wondered when she had last made a choice without first checking whether it would disrupt the life she had carefully assembled. Disruption used to scare her. Now, it simply felt unnecessary. She walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The light above the sink was soft and familiar, slightly too warm, something she had meant to replace for months. She drank slowly, aware of how often she rushed through moments like this without registering them. Time was no longer something she explored. It was something she organized. She leaned against the counter and thought about how often she postponed things that didn't feel urgent. Trips she told herself she could take later when work was calmer. Conversations she delayed because they might change the dynamic she relied on. Creative ideas she dismissed because they didn't fit into her current version of responsibility later had become a safe place to leave parts of herself. She remembered moments when she had almost chosen differently. Job offers she declined because they felt unstable. Moves she didn't make because they lacked guarantees. People she didn't pursue because the outcome was uncertain. At the time, those decisions felt protective. Now, they felt expensive in a way she hadn't anticipated, not dramatically, quietly. She returned to the living room and sat down on the couch. It was firm, supportive, chosen because it would last. She remembered testing several options and selecting this one because it felt sensible, reliable, unlikely to disappoint. She wondered how many other choices in her life had been guided by the same quiet logic. Not wrong choices, just careful ones. She imagined her life 5 years from now if she continued exactly as she was. The image wasn't unpleasant. It looked stable, familiar. Orderly. The same apartment, perhaps a different couch, similar routines, slightly more savings, slightly fewer unknowns. The image didn't frighten her. It simply felt incomplete. She understood then that the cost of stability rarely announces itself as loss. It shows up as repetition, as days that blend together because nothing interrupts them, as time that passes without leaving a distinct mark. No warns you about that part. There was no dramatic turning point waiting for her. No urgent decision that needed to be made that night. No mistake to correct. But something had shifted. From that evening on, she knew she would start noticing the small moments where she chose safety automatically. Where she said no not because something felt wrong, but because it felt easier to keep things as they were. She would notice how often her time was spent maintaining the life she had built, rather than questioning what else it might still hold. She didn't need to change anything yet. Awareness was enough to alter the way her days felt. She turned off the lights and went to bed without restlessness, without resolution, just awake in a new way. More attentive, less certain. She understood that somewhere ahead, a moment would arrive when practicality would no longer be a sufficient answer. When preserving everything she had would quietly ask her to let something go. She didn't know what that something was, but she knew she would recognize the weight of the choice when it appeared. And that knowledge, steady, restrained, impossible to dismiss, had already begun to rearrange how she saw the path in front of her. Not urgent, just no longer automatic.